Millionaire Richard Thompson never imagined that when he arrived home early from a business meeting, he would catch his wife, her name Victoria, forcing Amelia, the cleaning lady's 12-year-old daughter, to clean the floor of the luxury bathroom with her bare hands while shouting, "People like you need to learn early on where his place is in this house." The girl was kneeling on the cold marble, tears streaming silently down her face as she scrubbed a stain that clearly wasn't there. Her small hands trembled, not from the cold, but from sheer humiliation. Victoria, with his impeccable blonde hair and expensive jewelry, watched the scene with a cruel satisfaction that Richard had never witnessed in 15 years of marriage. "And stop whining," Victoria continued. "Her mother isn't here to defend you. You're going to learn to be useful, or you're leaving this house with her." Richard stood frozen in the bathroom doorway, processing the diabolical scene unfolding before her. Grace, the dedicated housekeeper who had worked for them for 6 years, had gone out to get cleaning supplies. It was exactly the opportunity Victoria had been waiting for to show her true colors to a defenseless child. At 45, Richard had built a real estate empire valued at $300 million. He had always prided himself on treating all employees with respect and dignity. But there was her, a woman who smiled sweetly at charity events and talked about social equality, psychologically torturing a 12-year-old girl. Victoria. Richard's voice was low, controlled, but charged with an intensity that made his wife turn around abruptly. "Richard, I didn't hear you come in." The fake smile appeared instantly on her face. "I was just teaching Grace's daughter some responsibility. You know how it is, if we don't educate them from an early age." Amelia tried to get up quickly, wiping her tears with the back of her hand, but Richard saw the fear in her eyes. It wasn't just fear of Victoria, but the kind of fear that children develop when they are constantly humiliated by adults who are supposed to protect them. "What kind of responsibilities?" Richard asked, walking slowly toward the two of them. "Oh, you know." Victoria gestured nervously. "Basic cleaning, organization. Things that will be useful for her future." Richard bent down to Amelia's height, completely ignoring Victoria. "How are you, sweetheart?" The girl glanced quickly at Victoria, clearly calculating whether it was safe to answer honestly. "I'm fine, Mr. Thompson," she whispered. But Richard wasn't a successful businessman by accident. He could read people, knew when someone was lying out of fear. And in that moment, seeing that child trembling before her, something stirred inside him that even his business enemies would recognize immediately: the deadly calm that precedes a devastating storm. For years, he had noticed small, strange signs. Grace would sometimes bring Amelia to work, and the girl would become visibly tense when Victoria was around. Conversations would stop abruptly when he entered a room. The way her talked about educating these people, when she thought he wasn't paying attention. Now it all made sense. But Victoria had no idea that she had just awakened something in Richard that she could never control or manipulate. "Amelia," Richard said gently, "go to the kitchen and get a snack. Her mother will be back soon." When the girl ran off, Richard turned to Victoria with an expression that she had never seen before. It was the same expression that he used when he was about to completely destroy a competitor in business. "We need to talk," he said simply. But Victoria hadn't yet realized that she had just crossed a line of no return. She didn't know that Richard had grown up in a poor family and that her black grandmother had been humiliated by wealthy employers in the same way. And most importantly, she had no idea that this moment of gratuitous cruelty was about to cost her much more than her conscience could imagine. If you're feeling the same outrage as Richard at this point, subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple act of cruelty would turn into a lesson in justice that none of those involved would ever forget. That evening, during the dinner served by Grace, Richard observed every interaction with a microscopic attention that his business rivals knew so well. Victoria was particularly excited, talking about the charity event she would be organizing the following month to help needy children, while Amelia remained in the kitchen, clearly avoiding any eye contact with her boss. "Honey, you haven't touched the salmon," Victoria commented, smiling sweetly. "Grace outdid herself today." "I was thinking about our conversation earlier," Richard replied, cutting a piece of food without actually eating it. "About raising children." Victoria laughed, a sound that once had been musical to his ears but now seemed strangely false. "Oh, you know how I am. Sometimes I'm too strict, but it's for her own good. These people need to understand boundaries from an early age." "These people," Richard repeated slowly, letting the words hang in the air. "You know what I mean," Victoria said, pouring herself more wine. If we don't establish a hierarchy, she starts to forget her place. Amelia was playing in the main room yesterday, getting the suede sofa dirty. I had to be firm. Richard felt something cold run down her spine. Firm how? Nothing too much. I just explained that certain areas of the house are for the family, not for, well, you understand. What Richard understood was that his wife of 15 years had revealed herself to be someone completely different from the woman he had fallen in love with. Or perhaps, and this possibility was even more disturbing, she had always been this way and he had simply never paid attention to the signs. That night, unable to sleep, Richard went down to his office and turned on his computer. For 2 hours, he revisited memories he had buried decades ago. Her grandmother Josephine, a dignified black woman who had worked as a maid for wealthy families her entire life. He remembered weekends at her house, listening to stories about cruel mistresses who made him redo perfect work out of pure sadism. Richard, my boy, she would say, never forget where you came from. Money can change your situation, but it can't change your heart. And if one day you have power, remember how it feels to be trampled on. Josephine had died when he was 16, but her words had shaped every ethical decision in his career. Now, at 45, a respected multimillionaire, he discovered that he was married to exactly the kind of person who had tortured her grandmother. The next morning, Richard decided to work from home. He settled into his office with the door ajar, pretending to be absorbed in spreadsheets while discreetly observing the dynamics of the house. What he discovered over the next few hours was even worse than he had imagined. Victoria had developed an elaborate system of psychological cruelty. Whenever Grace went out shopping or was busy elsewhere in the house, she would find Amelia and invent humiliating tasks for her. She made the girl reorganize the library alphabetically, then by color, then by size. She made her clean windows that were already spotless. She made her sweep the same hallway multiple times. "You're too slow," Richard heard Victoria say sharply when Amelia took too long to fold linen napkins. "At her age, I already knew how to work properly. But you're different, aren't you?" The casual cruelty in her voice made Richard clench his fists under the table. Victoria wasn't just abusing a child, she was systematically trying to break Amelia's spirit, to make her accept that his value as a human being was inferior. During lunch, Victoria casually remarked, "You know, dear, I think we need to talk about Grace and her daughter's boundaries in this house. They're getting too comfortable." "Comfortable how?" Richard asked, though he already knew he would hear more venom disguised as domestic concern. "Amelia has been very bold lately. The other day I caught her looking at books in the library. Expensive books, Richard. And yesterday she asked about his shoes, if they were Italian. That curiosity is not healthy." Richard almost choked on his water. "A 12-year-old asked curious questions and that bothers you?" "They're not innocent questions," Victoria insisted. "It's envy. She's starting to question why we have nice things and she doesn't. That kind of thinking leads to bigger problems." It was at that moment that Richard fully understood with whom he was married. Victoria didn't see Amelia as a curious and intelligent child, but as a potential threat to the social order she considered natural and desirable. For Victoria, keeping a black girl in his place was a moral imperative. That afternoon, while Victoria was at the spa, Richard had a careful conversation with Grace. What he discovered was devastating. For months, Victoria had been systematically humiliating Amelia, always when Grace wasn't around. The girl had begged her mother not to say anything, afraid they would lose their jobs. "Mr. Thompson," Grace said with tears in her eyes, "I need this job. I have nowhere else to go with Amelia. But I don't know what to do anymore." Richard looked at this woman who had kept his house spotless for 6 years, who was raising an intelligent and educated daughter on her own, who was being tortured by an impossible situation. At that moment, he wasn't just a husband confronting his wife. He was Josephine's grandson, and the time had finally come to honor the promise he had made at her grave. "Grace," he said calmly, "you and Amelia aren't going anywhere. But Victoria doesn't know that she has just awakened something she should never have touched." That night, while Victoria cheerfully described her plans for the charity event, Richard made his own plans. Victoria thought she knew her husband, a successful businessman but essentially passive in domestic matters. What she didn't know was that Richard Thompson had built his empire by systematically destroying people who underestimated her capacity for strategic revenge. And for the first time in 15 years of marriage, That ability would be directed at someone within his own home. Victoria was about to discover that humiliating the maid's 12-year-old daughter was not only an act of gratuitous cruelty, but the biggest strategic mistake of her life. The following Monday, Richard cancelled all his meetings and did something he hadn't done in years. He spent the entire day at home, officially working in his office, but in reality documenting every move of his wife through a system of cameras he had discreetly installed over the weekend. What he discovered in the first few hours was even more systematic and cruel than he had imagined. Victoria had developed a precise schedule of psychological torture. Always at 9:15 a.m., when Grace left for shopping, she would call Amelia to help with impossible tasks. Reorganize the china cabinet by size, then by color, then by shine. Clean mirrors that were already perfect until they were really clean. Sweeping leaves from the garden on a windy morning. "You're taking too long," Victoria would say in that sweet voice Richard knew so well, but which now sounded like poison disguised as honey. At her age, I already knew how to work properly. But you're different, aren't you? You have to learn from an early age where her place is. Richard recorded everything. Every cruel word, every unnecessary humiliation, every moment when his wife deliberately broke the spirit of a 12-year-old child who had done nothing but be born into the wrong family. But it was on Tuesday that Richard discovered something that completely changed his strategy. While organizing old wedding documents, he found a box of letters that Victoria thought she had hidden. They were correspondence between her and her friends from a social club, dated 2 years ago, when Grace had started bringing Amelia to work during school vacations. "Dear Patricia," read one of the letters in Victoria's elegant handwriting, "you can't imagine how annoying it is to have this little black child running around the house. It's as if he doesn't know his place. Yesterday, I caught her leafing through magazines in the main living room. Expensive magazines, Patricia. I had to be firm and explain that certain things are not for people like her. I'm thinking of suggesting that her, stop bringing the girl." Richard felt nauseous reading those words. Victoria wasn't just abusing Amelia on impulse or out of stress, as she had tried to justify. It was a calculated campaign to put the girl in her place, before his natural intelligence became a threat to the social order that Victoria considered sacred. That afternoon, while Victoria was at the spa getting treatments with the money Richard earned, he made a call to James Mitchell, the most respected private investigator in town and one of the few black men who had managed to break through the barriers of the local professional elite. "Richard Thompson," James said when he answered. "I wasn't expecting your call. I hear you're in need of some special services." "How did you know?" "Let's just say that certain news travels fast in certain circles. Grace Williams works for him, doesn't she? His daughter, Amelia, goes to the same school as my niece. A bright girl, but lately she's been strangely quiet." Richard realized that James already knew much more than he was saying. "I need your help documenting some situations that are happening in my home." Situations involving his wife and Grace's daughter? Richard's silence was answer enough. "I understand perfectly," James continued. "Coincidentally, I've been noticing some troubling patterns of behavior in certain families of the local elite. Her, for example, has been quite active in the Preservation of Traditional Values group on Facebook. Interesting posts about maintaining natural hierarchies and properly educating certain people." Richard had never heard of this group. What kind of posts? Screenshots of conversations where she and other society women discuss methods for disciplining employees who don't know their place. Her wife is particularly eloquent about training children from an early age to accept their social position. Richard's blood ran cold. Victoria wasn't just abusing Amelia, she was sharing methods of cruelty with other elite women, as if it were a social hobby. "James, I need everything you can find on these activities. And I need evidence that will be unquestionable in any court of law." "I've been working on it for 3 weeks, Richard. Ever since my niece told me that Amelia arrived at school in tears after being forced to apologize to her wife for looking at things she wasn't supposed to." That evening, as Victoria excitedly described his plans for a charity gala to help less fortunate children, Richard watched every gesture, every inflection of his voice, every fake smile that he could now see with absolute clarity. "You know, dear," she said, pouring herself French wine that cost more than Grace's monthly salary, "I think I finally managed to teach Grace's daughter some important lessons. She's been much more respectful lately." "What kind of lessons?" Richard asked casually. "Oh, nothing much. Just explaining about appropriate boundaries, about respecting property that isn't his. Children need to understand hierarchies from an early age, don't you think? Richard nodded, pretending to agree, while mentally adding another recorded confession to the growing mountain of evidence against her. The next morning, James called with a discovery that would change everything. Richard, you need to see what I found in the records of domestic workers who worked for her before Grace. In the last 10 years, at least 6 families have resigned without explanation. I managed to contact 3 of them. And they all had daughters between the ages of 8 and 15. They all reported that her daughters began to have psychological problems after a few months of working in her home. One of the mothers said her daughter developed panic attacks whenever she saw blonde women. Richard realized he had uncovered not just an isolated case of cruelty, but a decades-long pattern of systematic abuse that her wife had perfected into a sadistic art form. James, he said, her voice taking on the icy tone he used to destroy competitors in business, I want you to document everything. Every post, every message, every testimony. And I want you to prepare a complete dossier that leaves no room for alternative interpretations. It's already being prepared. But Richard, I need to warn you, when this comes to light, it won't just destroy her wife. It will shake the entire social structure of this city. There are a lot of powerful people involved in her group. Richard smiled, but it wasn't a smile Victoria would recognize. It was the smile that appeared when he was about to completely rewrite the rules of the game. James, let me tell you something about his grandmother Josephine. She always said that when you have real power, you don't use it to protect yourself. You use it to protect those who cannot protect themselves. As he hung up the phone, Richard realized that Victoria had just awakened not only a betrayed husband, but the grandson of a woman who had suffered decades of silent humiliation. And unlike Josephine, he had enough resources, influence, and connections to ensure that justice was not only served, but that it became a permanent example. What Victoria didn't know was that his next training session with Amelia would be documented not only for personal use, but for a much wider audience than she could ever imagine. On Thursday, the day of Victoria's charity event to help needy children, Richard set in motion a plan that would turn the most anticipated gala night of the year into a public spectacle that none of those present would ever forget. The grand ballroom of the Metropole Hotel was impeccable, with 300 members of high society in attendance, including politicians, businesspeople, journalists, and influential figures in national philanthropy. Victoria circulated radiantly in his $15,000 dress, receiving compliments for his generosity and concern for the welfare of less fortunate children. Tonight is about giving opportunities to young people who were born into less privileged circumstances, Victoria said from the stage, her melodious voice echoing through the hall. I believe that every child deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of his background. The applause was warm. Flashes went off as she smiled for the cameras, completely oblivious to the fact that Richard was at the head table, watching every move of hers with the patience of a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. James Mitchell, elegantly dressed and wearing a press badge, circulated discreetly among the guests, distributing tablets with a presentation that would forever change everyone's perception of the hostess of the evening. At 9:30, just as Victoria took the stage for her keynote speech, Richard calmly rose from her table. "Excuse me," he said into the microphone, interrupting his wife. "Before my dear wife continues talking about dignity and respect for children, I would like to share with everyone some interesting discoveries I have made recently." The silence in the hall was instantaneous. Victoria looked at Richard with an expression of growing confusion, still not fully understanding what was happening. "James," Richard called, and the investigator approached the stage carrying a laptop. "Could you show us the videos you documented this week?" The first recording appeared on the giant screen behind Victoria. It was her forcing Amelia to reorganize the china cabinet for the 5th time in a row, shouting, "People like you need to learn from an early age what is his place in this house." A murmur of shock rippled through the audience. Victoria visibly paled, finally understanding the extent of what Richard had discovered. "This is her," Richard continued, her voice echoing through the hall's perfect acoustics, systematically humiliating a 12-year-old girl whose only crime was to be born into the wrong family. The second video showed Victoria deliberately knocking over a vase of flowers and forcing Amelia to clean up the shards with her bare hands. The third recording captured her laughing on the phone with a friend, describing how she had made the girl cry. "Richard, stop this," Victoria whispered into the microphone, but her voice was being broadcast throughout the hall. "You're taking everything out of context." Context. James Mitchell took the stage and opened a folder full of documents. Perhaps we should contextualize it with these conversations from the Preservation of Traditional Values Facebook group, where you discuss methods for disciplining employees who don't know his place. Screenshots of Victoria's posts appeared on the screen. Messages where she boasted about putting the maid's little girl in her place, and share humiliation techniques with other society ladies. The audience began to stir. Some guests got up and walked toward the exit, clearly not wanting to be associated with the scandal unfolding live. We also have, James continued, testimonies from 6 previous families who worked for the Thompsons. All report similar patterns of psychological abuse directed specifically at the employees' daughters. Victoria tried to leave the stage, but Richard gently blocked his path. "We're not done yet, dear," he said, his voice now laden with a coldness she had never heard before. "The guests need to know exactly who they are contributing to tonight." The 4th recording was the most devastating. Victoria speaking on the phone with Patricia, her best friend. "You should see how I managed to break that little black girl's spirit. Now she doesn't even look me in the eye. He's finally learned his place." The silence in the hall was absolute now, broken only by the sound of chairs being dragged as more people got up to leave. Camera flashes went off frantically, no longer to capture moments of charity, but to document one of the biggest social scandals of the decade. "Richard," Victoria tried once more, tears beginning to stream down his carefully made-up face. "Can we talk about this at home?" "At home?" Richard laughed, but it was not a happy sound. "Victoria, you no longer have a home. The divorce papers were filed this morning. 50% of the assets, as determined by the prenuptial agreement you signed and apparently never read carefully." James approached the microphone once more. "I would also like to inform you that the State Attorney General's office, after reviewing all the evidence presented, has decided to open a formal investigation for moral harassment and mistreatment of a minor. The documents were delivered this afternoon." Victoria literally collapsed, her legs giving way as the reality of her situation hit her like an avalanche. It wasn't just a social scandal, it was the complete end of her life as she knew it. "And finally," Richard said, his voice now softening slightly, "I would like to introduce everyone to Amelia Williams." The 12-year-old girl stepped onto the stage, no longer wearing simple clothes, but an elegant dress and new shoes. By his side, Grace walked with the dignity of someone who could finally hold her head high. "Amelia will start at St. Margaret's Preparatory School next Monday, with a full scholarship funded by the Thompson Foundation," Richard announced. "Grace has been promoted to Domestic Operations Manager of our company, with a salary of $40,000 a year and all the benefits." The applause that began timidly turned into a standing ovation. Not for Victoria, who remained on the floor of the stage, but for Richard's courage in exposing the hypocrisy and for Grace and Amelia's dignity in the face of months of humiliation. "True charity," Richard concluded, looking directly at the cameras broadcasting live, "is not giving money to appear in photos. It is ensuring that a bright child has the same opportunities as any other, regardless of the color of her skin or her family's bank account." Victoria finally managed to stand up and staggered toward the back exit, but the camera flashes followed her relentlessly. Her social reputation was destroyed, her philanthropic endeavors ruined, her relationships with the local elite permanently damaged. The next day, the story was on the front page of every local newspaper and went viral on social media as a devastating example of racism disguised as charity. Victoria was officially removed from all charitable boards, her friends stopped answering his calls, and even the luxury beauty salon he frequented canceled his future appointments. Meanwhile, Richard watched Amelia playing in the garden of the house, finally free to be a child without fear of humiliation. But one question still hung over the whole situation. Did Victoria really understand the moral extent of what she had done, or was her only concern the social consequences of being exposed? The answer would come in a way that even Richard, with all his careful strategy, could not have predicted. 3 months later, the transformation was complete. Amelia walked the halls of St. Margaret's Preparatory School with the confidence of a child who had finally understood her true worth. Her grades were exemplary, and she had become a student council leader, organizing anti-bullying campaigns that inspired schools across the state. Grace, now operations manager at Thompson Enterprises, oversaw a team of 15 employees and earned more in a month than she had in an entire year as a cleaning lady. Richard had discovered that his administrative efficiency was as impressive as her dedication to cleaning. Victoria, on the other hand, was experiencing devastating social isolation. His former social circles had completely abandoned him. The Preservation of Traditional Values group was shut down after a federal investigation, and 3 of his members were facing charges of racial discrimination. The modest apartment she had managed to rent with her divorce settlement contrasted sharply with the mansion where she had once reigned as a cruel queen. "Mom, can I invite my friend Emma over for dinner on Saturday?" Amelia asked Grace as they organized documents in the company office. "Of course, dear. Our home has always had an open door for your friends." Richard watched the scene from his desk, remembering the words of his grandmother Josephine. "True power is not humiliating those below you, it is elevating those who deserve to be at the top." The sweetest justice was not seeing Victoria lose everything she valued, but witnessing Amelia discover everything she always deserved to have. A child who once cleaned floors on her knees because of the cruelty of others now debated public policy at student conferences, proving that talent knows no color, social class, or origin. Victoria had tried to destroy the spirit of a 12-year-old girl out of pure prejudice. Instead, she ended up creating one of the most promising young leaders of the new generation. Amelia not only survived cruelty, but she thrived despite it, turning her pain into purpose and her humiliation into strength. True charity, Richard learned, is not donating money to appear in photos. It is recognizing human potential where others see only prejudice and ensuring that no child has his future limited by the ignorance of adults who confuse privilege with superiority. If this story of transformation has touched his heart, subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove that the best revenge against her is to build a world where she finds no place to flourish.